The rain came down in sheets, hammering the glass walls of James Carter's sleek, modern mansion perched on the edge of Lake Union in Seattle. It was the kind of rain that made the city feel alive, relentless, cold, and loud, drowning out everything but the pounding of water against the world. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine from the fireplace flickering in the corner, casting a warm glow across the polished hardwood floors. The place was a masterpiece, open concept, all sharp lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the stormy gray water outside. But tonight, it felt more like a cage than a home. James stood in the middle of the sprawling foyer, his broad shoulders tense under a tailored black suit that probably cost more than most people's rent. His gray eyes, usually sharp and unreadable, were locked on the woman in front of him. Sarah Monroe. She was a mess, her auburn hair plastered to her face from the rain, her threadbare jacket dripping onto the floor, a cheap duffel bag slung over one shoulder. She didn't belong here, not in this world of wealth and precision. And yet, there she was, her hand on the doorknob, ready to walk out of his life forever. "Don't go, Sarah," James said, his voice low and rough like gravel under tires. He stepped forward, the contract, the damn piece of paper that had started all this, clutched in his hand. His fingers tightened around it, crumpling the edges. "I don't give a damn about this thing. I need you here, with me, with our kids." Sarah froze, her back to him, her knuckles whitening around the doorknob. The rain roared outside, a deafening backdrop to the silence stretching between them. Slowly she turned, her green eyes wide and shimmering with tears that mingled with the water streaking her cheeks. She looked small, fragile, like the wind might blow her away if she stepped outside. But there was something fierce in her gaze, something that had always caught him off guard. "You don't get it, James," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "This is what we signed up for. 90 days after the birth, that's the deal. I leave today. It's done." "Screw the deal," James snapped, his composure cracking like thin ice. He held up the contract, the ink smudged from the rain on his hands, and with one swift motion, he tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the air, sharp and final. He didn't stop there. He kept going, shredding it into pieces, letting them flutter to the floor like confetti from a celebration gone wrong. "You think I'd let you walk out after everything? You've changed me, Sarah. I'm begging you, stay." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She stared at him, disbelief etched into every line of her face. James Carter didn't beg. He didn't kneel. He was the guy who built a tech empire from nothing, who closed deals with a handshake and a cold stare. And yet, here he was, dropping to his knees on the hardwood, his hands reaching for hers. The rain battered the windows harder, as if the storm outside was cheering him on, or mocking him. "James," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. She took a step back, her duffel slipping off her shoulder and hitting the floor with a dull thud. "What the hell are you doing?" "I'm doing what I should have done months ago," he said, looking up at her. His suit was soaked now, clinging to his frame, but he didn't care. "I've been an idiot, okay? I thought I could control this, control us. But I can't. Not anymore. I don't want you to go. Not for the kids, not for some stupid legacy. Just for me." The words hung there, raw and unguarded. A confession he'd never meant to make. Sarah's breath hitched, and for a moment, she just stood there, the storm outside mirroring the one in her chest. She'd seen him at his worst. Cold, distant, barking orders, like she was some employee instead of the woman carrying his children. But this was something else. This was James Carter, stripped bare, and it scared her as much as it pulled her in. "You don't mean that," she said finally, shaking her head. "You're just freaking out because I'm leaving." You'll be fine without me. You always are." "No, I won't," he shot back, his voice rising. He stood up, closing the distance between them in 2 quick strides. "You don't get it, do you? I've got money, a big house, a company that runs itself. But it's all empty without you. I've been running from that truth since the day you walked in here." Sarah's eyes searched his, looking for the catch, the lie she'd learned to expect from people like him. But all she saw was a man unraveling, his walls crumbling faster than the rain could fall. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing his wet sleeve, tentative, like she was testing if he was real. "James, She stopped, swallowing hard. "I don't even know where to start with this." "Then don't," he said, his hand covering hers, warm against her cold skin. "Just stay. We'll figure it out. Together." The rain slowed to a drizzle, the world outside softening as if it knew something was shifting inside that mansion. Sarah's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. She didn't say yes, not yet, but she didn't pull away either. And that was enough for James, at least for now. 3 months earlier, none of this would have made sense. James Carter didn't do messy emotions. He didn't do begging. He was the guy who'd turned a startup in his garage into a tech giant, the kind of man who could buy anything he wanted, except, apparently, the one thing he'd never known he needed. He'd spent his life chasing control, building a fortress around himself after 2 marriages that left him with nothing but divorce papers and a bitter taste in his mouth. Love? That was for suckers. What he wanted was simpler. A kid, an heir, someone to carry his name when he was gone. No wife, no drama, just a clean transaction. That's where Sarah came in. He'd found her on a rainy afternoon near Pike Place Market, a skinny figure in a beat-up raincoat, holding out a trembling hand to strangers who didn't even look her way. She wasn't supposed to matter. She was just a means to an end, a desperate woman he could pay to give him what he couldn't get any other way. Artificial insemination, a fat check, and a one-way ticket out of his life. That was the plan. But plans have a way of falling apart, don't they? It started with the way she looked at him that first day, those green eyes cutting through his bullshit like a knife. Then came the news she was carrying 3 kids, not 1. Triplets. The kind of curveball that'd make anyone rethink their life. And somewhere along the line, between the doctor visits and the late-night talks in his kitchen, she stopped being a stranger. She became Sarah, stubborn, funny, tougher than she looked. And James? He became a guy who didn't know how to let her go. Back in the foyer, the shredded contract lay scattered across the floor, a soggy mess of ink and paper. The fireplace crackled, throwing shadows across the room. Sarah pulled her hand back, crossing her arms like she was trying to hold herself together. "I need to think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is a lot." James nodded, his jaw tight. "Take all the time you need. Just don't walk out that door." She didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. She picked up her duffel, slung it over her shoulder, and headed toward the stairs, back into the house, not out of it. James watched her go, his heart pounding like it hadn't in years. He didn't know what she'd decide, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't in forever. Hope. The rain kept falling outside, a steady rhythm against the windows. Upstairs, 3 tiny cribs sat in a nursery James had built with his own hands. 3 little lives that had turned his world upside down. And downstairs, a man who'd spent his life running from love stood alone, waiting for an answer he couldn't buy. Hey, if this twist has you hooked, hit that subscribe button and drop a rainy days in the comments. Let's see where this storm takes us. The rain hadn't let up all day in Seattle. It was one of those March afternoons where the sky seemed to dump everything it had, gray, heavy, relentless. Pike Place Market buzzed despite the weather, the air thick with the briny tang of fresh fish and the sharp bite of coffee from vendors hawking their wares. Tourists huddled under umbrellas, snapping pictures of the famous fish-tossing guys, while locals shuffled past with their hoods up, unfazed by the downpour. James Carter didn't belong here. Not really. He was a downtown guy, a penthouse and boardroom type, but today he was cutting through the chaos in his Tesla Model X, the sleek black car humming quietly against the wet pavement. He wasn't in a good mood. A morning full of investor calls had left him irritated, his tie loosened and his jaw tight. The light turned red just past the market, and he slammed on the brakes harder than necessary, the tires squeaking against the slick road. That's when he saw her, Sarah Monroe, standing on the corner like a drowned rat. Her auburn hair stuck to her face in wet clumps, her faded raincoat doing a piss-poor job of keeping her dry. She held out a shaky hand toward a guy in a mariner's cap, her voice so soft it barely cut through the rain. "Spare $1?" The guy didn't even glance her way, just kept walking. James rolled his eyes, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel. Another sob story, he thought. This city's full of them. He'd seen 100 people like her, down on their luck, clogging up the streets with their cardboard signs and sad eyes. He didn't have time for it. The light turned green, and he was about to gun it when she turned her head, and those green eyes locked onto his through the windshield. It wasn't pity or desperation he saw. It was something else, something raw and stubborn, like she was daring the world to keep kicking her down. It hit him like a punch to the gut, and he didn't know why. "Get lost," he muttered under his breath, stepping on the gas. The Tesla surged forward, splashing through a puddle that probably soaked her boots. He didn't care, or at least he told himself he didn't. But 2 blocks later, that look in her eyes was still clawing at him, gnawing at the edges of his carefully built walls. He cursed, yanked the wheel hard, and swung the car around in a U-turn that would have gotten him a ticket if any cops were around. The rain pounded harder as he pulled back up to the corner where she stood, still holding out that trembling hand like nothing had changed. He rolled down the window, the cold air rushing in and mixing with the leather and coffee scent of the car's interior. "Hey!" he barked, loud enough to cut through the noise of the storm. "Hop in." Sarah blinked, rain dripping off her nose, and took a step back. Her eyes narrowed, sizing him up like he was some creep looking for a quick score. Life on the streets had taught her to trust no one, especially not some rich guy in a fancy car. "I'm not that kind of girl," she said, her voice sharp despite the shiver running through it. "If that's what you're after, keep driving." James snorted, leaning an elbow on the window frame. "You think I'd waste my time on that? Look at you. You're a mess. No offense, but you're not exactly my type." He paused, then added, "You're safe with me. Just get in before you freeze your ass off out there." She hesitated, her gaze flicking from his face to the warm interior of the car and back again. There was something in his tone, not kindness exactly, but a blunt honesty that didn't feel like a lie. The rain wasn't letting up, and her boots were already soaked through. Finally, she shrugged, opened the door, and slid into the passenger seat, dripping water all over the leather. James didn't flinch. He just hit the gas and merged back into traffic, the windshield wipers slapping a steady rhythm. The silence was thick, broken only by the hum of the engine and the faint patter of rain on the roof. Sarah hugged her arms around herself, her wet coat squeaking against the seat. She looked young, maybe late 20s, but the lines around her eyes told a different story. One of too many nights with nowhere to go. James kept his eyes on the road, but he could feel her there, a quiet presence that somehow filled the whole damn car. "So," he said finally, his voice clipped, like he was negotiating a deal, which, in a way, he was. "I've got a proposition for you. Something that'll change your life." Sarah turned her head slowly, one eyebrow arching. "Yeah? I've heard that one before. Usually ends with me broke and some guy laughing." "Not this time," James said, his tone flat. "I'm not here to screw you over. I want a kid, my kid. No wife, no relationship, just a baby. You carry it. I pay you a fortune, and I take care of you till it's done. Then you're free to go." Her jaw dropped, and for a second, she just stared at him, like she was waiting for the punchline. "A kid?" she echoed, her voice rising. "You're picking up random women off the street to have your baby? What kind of psycho are you?" "The kind who's got everything but what matters," he shot back unfazed. "It's not what you think. No funny business. Artificial insemination. Clean, simple, professional. You in or out?" Sarah laughed, a short, bitter sound that didn't match the softness of her face. "You're serious. Jesus, you're actually serious." She ran a hand through her wet hair, pushing it back from her forehead. "Why me? You don't even know my name." James shrugged, his eyes flicking to her for the first time since she'd gotten in. "Don't need to. You're here, you're breathing, and you look like you could use a break. That's enough." She shook her head, staring out the window at the blurred lights of the city. "You're nuts," she muttered. But there was a crack in her voice, a hint of something breaking. She'd been on the streets for years, ever since the music gigs dried up and the eviction notice landed. She'd come to Seattle chasing a dream, some big break as a pianist that never came. Now she was just another ghost in the rain, invisible to everyone. Until now. "What's the catch?" she asked, turning back to him. "There's always a catch." "No catch," James said, pulling the car into a quiet side street and killing the engine. The rain drummed on the roof, a steady beat that matched the tension in the air. "You get a place to stay, food, clothes, medical care, everything you need till the kid's born. After that, I wire you enough cash to start over wherever you want. That's it." Sarah chewed her lip, her fingers twisting the frayed hem of her coat. "And you just take the baby. I walk away?" "Yeah," he said, his voice hard. "That's the deal. No strings." She looked at him then, really looked at him. He was older, mid-40s maybe, with sharp cheekbones and a jawline that could cut glass. His gray eyes were cold, calculating, like he'd already worked out every angle of this insane plan. But there was something else there, too. Something buried deep, a flicker of loneliness he didn't even know he was showing. "I don't even know who you are," she said quietly. "James Carter," he replied, leaning back in his seat. "Tech guy. Made a lot of money, lost a lot of faith in people. That's all you need to know." "Sarah Monroe," she said after a beat, her voice softer now. "Used to play piano. Lost. Everything else?" He nodded, like that settled it. "So, Sarah Monroe, you in?" She didn't answer right away. The rain kept falling, the city humming beyond the glass. She thought about the cold nights under overpasses, the hunger that never went away, the dreams she'd buried years ago. And then she thought about this guy, this stranger with his crazy offer and his cold eyes, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, this was her way out. "Fine," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm in." James didn't smile, didn't say anything else. He just started the car and pulled back onto the road, the Tesla gliding through the rain like nothing had changed. But everything had. They both knew it, even if neither of them would admit it yet. The fertility clinic sat smack in the middle of downtown Seattle, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that screamed money. Inside, everything was pristine. White walls, spotless floors, the faint hum of high-end equipment buzzing like a quiet heartbeat. The place smelled like antiseptic and ambition, a sterile bubble where people like James Carter turned dreams into science. It was late April now, a month after Sarah had climbed into his Tesla and said yes to his insane deal. The rain had eased up today, leaving the city slick and shimmering under a weak sun. But inside the clinic, the air felt heavy with something else, anticipation, maybe, or dread. Sarah lay back on the examination table, her hands fidgeting at her sides. She'd traded her ratty raincoat for a clean pair of jeans and a hoodie James had someone drop off at the guest house where she'd been staying, a little cottage behind his Lake Union mansion. She still looked out of place here, her auburn hair tied back in a messy ponytail, her green eyes darting around the room like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. James stood by the door, arms crossed, his gray suit crisp and his expression unreadable. He hadn't said much on the drive over, just stared out the window like he was running numbers in his head. The doctor, a middle-aged guy with a calm voice and a clipboard, smeared cold gel across Sarah's stomach, the chill making her flinch. "All right, let's see how things are going," he said, sliding the ultrasound wand over her skin. The screen flickered to life, a grainy black-and-white blur that didn't mean much to Sarah until a sound broke through the silence. A quick, steady thump, thump, thump. Her breath caught, and she turned her head toward the monitor, her eyes widening. "There's the heartbeat," the doctor said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Strong and healthy." Sarah's hand drifted to her stomach, her fingers brushing the spot where the wand rested. "That's it?" she whispered, her voice shaky with something she couldn't name. She'd known this was coming. Hell, she'd signed up for it. But hearing that tiny rhythm hit her harder than she'd expected. It was real now. There was a life inside her, one she'd agreed to give away. James shifted his weight, his jaw tightening as he stared at the screen. He didn't say anything, just kept his eyes fixed on that little pulsing dot. The doctor adjusted the wand, and then another thump, thump, thump joined the first, overlapping it in a chaotic, beautiful mess. Sarah's head snapped up, her brows furrowing. "Wait, what's that?" she asked, her voice rising. "Is that normal?" The doctor's smile widened, and he moved the wand again. A third rhythm kicked in, thump, 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 layering over the others like a drumline gone wild. "It's not just one," he said, pointing to the screen where 3 tiny shapes flickered into view. "You're carrying triplets. Congratulations." The room went dead quiet, save for those 3 little heartbeats hammering away. Sarah's mouth fell open, her hand pressing harder against her stomach like she could feel them already. "Triplets?" she echoed, half laughing, half gasping. "3? You're kidding me." James didn't move. His arms stayed crossed, his face a blank slate. But inside, his mind was spinning out of control. 1 kid was the plan, 1 clean, manageable piece of his legacy. 3. That was chaos. That was a whole damn family he hadn't signed up for. His chest tightened, a cold sweat prickling under his collar. He should have been thrilled. More bang for his buck, right? But all he felt was a wall slamming up between him and whatever this was becoming. Sarah turned to him, her eyes bright with a mix of shock and something softer, something warm. 3 little lives, James. Can you believe it? "Yeah," he said, his voice flat, almost clipped. "Well, don't get attached. This is still a deal. Nothing more." The warmth in her face flickered out, replaced by a sharp, hurt look. "What?" she said, sitting up a little, the paper sheet crinkling under her. "You're kidding yourself if you think it's that simple." "It is that simple," he shot back, uncrossing his arms and stepping closer to the door, like he needed an escape route. "We're not playing house here, Sarah. You're doing a job. That's it." The doctor cleared his throat, sensing the tension, and busied himself with the clipboard. Sarah stared at James, her jaw tight, her hands balling into fists on the table. "A job," she repeated, her voice low and bitter. "Right. Just a paycheck with 3 heartbeats." James didn't answer. He turned his head, looking out the window at the city skyline instead of her. He couldn't explain it, not to her, not to himself, but those 3 little blips on the screen had rattled him more than any boardroom showdown ever had. He'd spent years building a life he could control, a world where emotions didn't get in the way. Now, with every thump, 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 that control was slipping, and he hated it. The drive back to the mansion was silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you like a weight. The Tesla's tires hissed against the wet road, the wipers swiping lazily now that the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Sarah sat with her arms crossed, staring out the passenger window at the gray blur of Seattle. James gripped the wheel tighter than he needed to, his knuckles white. He could still hear those heartbeats in his head, echoing like a warning he didn't want to hear. When they pulled into the driveway, the mansion loomed ahead. Sharp angles, glass walls, a fortress against the world. Sarah didn't wait for him to say anything. She shoved the door open and climbed out, her sneakers crunching on the gravel as she headed for the guest house out back. James watched her go, his hands still on the wheel, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Inside the main house, he poured himself a bourbon, the amber liquid glinting in the low light of his office. The room was all dark wood and leather, a space that screamed power, his kingdom. He dropped into the chair behind his desk, staring at the glass like it might have answers. Triplets. 3 kids. It should have been a win. More than he'd bargained for, a legacy times 3. But instead of victory, all he felt was a creeping panic, a fear that this was spinning out of his hands. He'd been burned before. 2 ex-wives who'd loved his bank account more than him, who'd left him with nothing but scars and a distrust so deep it was part of his DNA. This deal with Sarah was supposed to be different. No mess, no feelings, just a transaction. But those heartbeats, they weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They were real, and so was she. The guest house light flicked on across the yard, a soft glow cutting through the dusk. Sarah was in there, probably pacing, probably pissed at him. He took a swig of bourbon, the burn sliding down his throat, and tried to push it all down. The guilt, the doubt, the stupid tug in his gut that wouldn't let him ignore her. Later that night, Sarah sat on the edge of the guest house bed, her hands resting on her stomach. The place was small but cozy. Wood floors, a quilted bedspread, a window overlooking the lake. It was more than she'd had in years, but it still felt like borrowed time. She could still hear James's voice in her head. "Don't get attached." Like it was that easy, like she could just switch off whatever was growing inside her. Not just the babies, but the hope she hadn't felt in forever. She'd lost everything once. Her music, her apartment, her dreams, back when the world decided she wasn't good enough. She'd come to Seattle chasing a gig at some fancy lounge, only to end up broke and sleeping under bridges. This deal with James was supposed to be her ticket out, a way to claw her way back to something like a life. But now, with 3 little heartbeats thumping away, it wasn't just about her anymore. She stood up, crossing to the window, and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. The mansion's lights glowed in the distance, James's fortress against the world. He was an asshole sometimes, cold, distant, like he'd rather die than admit he cared. But she'd seen cracks in that armor, moments when he looked at her like she wasn't just a means to an end. And now he was shutting her out, building that wall back up brick by brick. "Fine," she muttered to herself, her breath fogging the glass. "You want to play it like that? I can too." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Those 3 little lives weren't just his. They were hers too, at least for now. And no matter how hard James tried to keep this clean and simple, she knew it was already messy as hell. Things are heating up. Will James open up or push her away? Subscribe now and tell us your guess with a triple trouble in the comments. The storm crashed over Lake Union like it was out for blood, a wild beast of wind and rain tearing through Seattle's summer night. It was late July, 6 months into this insane deal between James Carter and Sarah Monroe, and the weather had turned vicious, gusts rattling the mansion's glass walls, rain hammering down in sheets, thunder booming like a warning shot. Inside, the air carried the faint, smoky scent of cedar from the fireplace, but it couldn't mask the unease that had been festering for weeks. James and Sarah had been circling each other like strangers sharing a battlefield, close, but never close enough. Sarah stood at the top of the mansion's wide staircase, her bare feet planted on the soft runner, one hand gripping the banister for balance. She was 6 months pregnant now, her belly stretching the faded Seahawks t-shirt she'd swiped from James's laundry pile. Her auburn hair fell in tangled waves around her shoulders, her face pale and drawn under the dim glow of the hallway light. She'd been living in the main house for a month, James's call, though he'd brushed it off as practical. She didn't fight it. The guest house was fine, but here she had a real bed, a killer view of the lake, and a nursery he'd been quietly building down the hall, even if he pretended it was just storage. Tonight, though, something felt off. The dizziness had been nagging her all day, a low hum in her skull she'd chalked up to the triplets wearing her out. She took a step down, her hand sliding along the banister, when the floor seemed to tilt. Her vision swam, black spots blooming at the edges, and her foot missed the next step. She lurched forward with a choked gasp, arms flailing, and then she was falling, tumbling down the stairs in a chaotic blur of pain and fear. She hit the bottom hard, her body slamming into the hardwood, a sharp jolt shooting up her spine as she landed on her side. "James!" she screamed, the sound tearing out of her, ragged and primal. Pain pulsed through her ribs, her wrist, but all she could feel was the panic clawing at her chest. Her hands flew to her stomach, pressing against the swell of her belly. "James, help me!" Upstairs, James was sprawled in his office chair, a glass of bourbon dangling from his hand. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of his laptop, numbers flickering on the screen he hadn't touched in an hour. His mind was elsewhere, on Sarah, on the way her laugh had started slipping into his days, on those 3 heartbeats he couldn't shake since the ultrasound. He'd been keeping her at a distance, locking down anything that threatened his control, but it was a lie wearing thin. Her scream hit him like a gunshot, and the glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor as he bolted upright. He tore out of the office, nearly tripping over the rug, and hit the stairs at a sprint. "Sarah!" he yelled, his voice breaking as he vaulted down the steps. He found her at the bottom, a crumpled heap against the polished wood, one arm bent wrong, the other clutching her stomach. Her face was twisted in agony, tears streaming down her cheeks, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Christ, what the hell happened?" "I fell," she sobbed, her voice barely holding together. "James, it hurts. I can't feel them." "Stop, don't move," he said, dropping to his knees beside her. His hands trembled as he reached out, hovering over her like she might shatter under his touch. Her eyes were wide, wild with fear, and it gutted him. "You're gonna be fine, okay? Just stay with me." He didn't wait for her to answer. He slid one arm under her knees, the other around her shoulders, and lifted her in a single desperate motion. She was heavier now, the weight of the triplets straining her frame, but she felt small in his arms, fragile in a way that made his chest ache. Her head slumped against him, her fingers digging into his shirt as a low moan escaped her lips. "James, I can walk," she mumbled, her words slurring, but he shook his head hard. "No, you can't," he snapped, his voice rough with panic he couldn't hide. "Don't even try." He kicked the front door open with his foot, the storm roaring in to meet them. Rain lashed his face, soaking his clothes in seconds, the wind howling like it wanted to rip her from his grip. Sarah curled into him, her wet hair plastering against his neck, her breath hot and ragged against his collarbone. The Tesla gleamed in the driveway, a dark lifeline in the chaos, and he wrestled the passenger door open, easing her onto the seat. She winced, her body tensing, and the sound drove a spike of dread through him. He dove into the driver's seat, water dripping everywhere, and slammed the car into gear. The tires screeched on the wet gravel as he peeled out, the engine roaring against the storm. The road ahead was a black void, rain blurring everything, but he didn't care. He floored it, weaving through the streets like a man possessed. His hands clenched the wheel, his pulse pounding in his ears, and he kept stealing glances at her, her pale face, her shaky breaths. "Talk to me," he said, his voice tight. "You still with me?" "Yeah," she whispered, her hand pressed to her stomach, her eyes half closed. I think they're okay. I felt a kick. Maybe." "That's it," he said, forcing calm he didn't feel. "Keep 'em kicking. We're almost there." Swedish Medical Center loomed through the downpour, its lights a hazy glow against the night. James swerved into the ER drop-off, the car skidding to a stop, and he was out before it fully settled. He yanked her door open, ignoring the rain, and lifted her again, her weight sinking into his arms as he charged inside. Nurses rushed toward him, a stretcher rattling behind, but he didn't let go. Not yet. "She's 6 months pregnant. Triplets," he shouted at the nearest doctor, a wiry guy with quick hands. "Fell down a damn staircase. Fix her. Now." "We've got it," the doctor said, motioning the team forward as James finally lowered her onto the stretcher. Her fingers slipped from his shirt, and he stepped back, chest heaving, as they wheeled her through the double doors. The last he saw was her pale hand reaching for nothing before the doors swung shut. The waiting room was a sterile hell. Harsh lights, the stale smell of coffee, the low buzz of a TV no one watched. James didn't sit. He paced like a caged animal, his wet shoes squeaking on the tile, his fists balled tight. His shirt clung to him, cold and heavy, but he barely noticed. His mind was a storm of its own. Images of Sarah crumpled on the floor, her voice breaking, those 3 little lives he'd never wanted to care about. He'd built an empire, faced down ruin. But this was a fear he couldn't outrun. A nurse stepped out after an eternity, her voice cutting through his haze. "Mr. Carter, she's stable. Babies are fine. Strong heartbeats, no bleeding. She's got a cracked rib and a sprained wrist, but she'll pull through. You got her here fast." James nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "She awake?" "Yeah," the nurse said, pointing down the hall. "Room 214. Go easy. She's been through it." He didn't need telling twice. He pushed past, his soaked clothes leaving a trail, and found her room. It was dim, the storm a faint rumble outside, the beep of a monitor steady and slow. Sarah lay propped up, an IV in her arm, her wrist bandaged, her face still pale but alive. Her eyes flicked to him as he stepped in, and a tired smirk tugged at her lips. "You look like crap," she croaked, her voice rough but warm. He huffed a laugh, dragging a chair over and collapsing into it. "Yeah, well, you look like you took on a staircase and lost." "Pretty much," she said, her smirk fading. She shifted, grimacing, and rested a hand on her stomach. "They're okay, though. Kicking like crazy now." "Good," he said, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. His gray eyes softened, holding hers. "You had me freaking out, Monroe." "Didn't mean to," she murmured, her fingers brushing her belly. "Thanks for not leaving me down there." "No way I would," he said, his voice low, firm. He reached out, his hand settling over hers on the blanket, and she didn't pull away. Her fingers curled into his, small but strong, and the contact sent a shiver through him he couldn't shake. "You didn't have to stick around," she said after a beat, her voice quiet. "I'd have managed." "Bullshit," he replied, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "I wasn't leaving you, not after that." She looked at him, her green eyes piercing, and saw something she hadn't before. A crack in the armor, a man who'd run through a storm for her. "Guess you're not as cold as you pretend," she said, her thumb brushing his hand. "Guess not," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't move, didn't let go, and neither did she. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle, the night settling. Inside, something new took root. A fragile, unspoken thing neither of them was ready to name. That was close. Want to see how they pull through? Hit subscribe and drop a stormy night in the comments to stay in the loop. The October air in Seattle carried a crisp bite, the kind that sneaks up after summer's last gasp. 3 months had passed since that stormy night when Sarah tumbled down the stairs, and the mansion on Lake Union had settled into a strange new rhythm. The nursery was finished now. 3 cribs lined up under a window with a view of the water, stuffed animals perched on a shelf James had built himself. The triplets were due any day, and the tension between James Carter and Sarah Monroe had softened into something neither of them talked about. A quiet truce. A shared space that felt almost like home. But tonight, that truce was about to shatter. It started with a twinge. Sarah standing in the kitchen, chopping carrots for a stew she'd insisted on making. The air smelled of garlic and thyme, the radio humming some old Springsteen tune. She was 9 months along now, her belly a full, heavy curve under a loose sweater, her auburn hair tied back in a messy bun. The twinge turned into a stab, sharp enough to make her drop the knife with a clatter, her hands flying to her stomach. "James!" she called, her voice tight, urgent. She braced herself against the counter as a contraction rolled through her, fierce and fast. "It's time!" He was in the living room scrolling through emails on his phone when her shout hit him. He bolted upright, the phone hitting the couch as he ran in, his gray eyes wide. "What's wrong? You okay?" "They're coming," she gasped, gripping the counter harder, her face paling as another wave hit. "Now!" James didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm, steadying her, and snatched his keys off the hook. "Let's go," he said, his voice calm, but edged with something raw. He guided her out to the Tesla, her breaths short and sharp, and peeled out of the driveway toward Swedish Medical Center. The city blurred past. Wet streets glinting under streetlights, the Space Needle a faint shadow in the distance. Sarah clutched his hand on the gear shift, her nails digging in, and he didn't pull away. "I'm here," he said, low and steady, as he swerved into the ER drop-off. "I've got you." The delivery room was a whirlwind. White walls, beeping monitors, nurses moving in a practiced dance. Sarah lay on the bed, sweat beading on her forehead, her hands gripping the rails as contractions came hard and fast. James stood beside her, his shirt untucked, his hair a mess from running his hands through it. He'd never felt so useless, watching her fight through the pain, her breaths ragged, her green eyes locked on his like he was her anchor. "Breathe, Sarah," he said, his voice rough but firm. "You're doing great. Just keep going." "I'm trying," she gritted out, a half-sob breaking through as another contraction hit. "God, this hurts." "I know," he said, squeezing her hand. "You're tougher than this. You've got it." Hours dragged on, each minute stretching into forever. Then finally, the first cry, a piercing wail that cut through the chaos. A boy, red-faced and squirming, handed off to a nurse. James's throat tightened, his chest aching with something he couldn't name. Then the second, a boy again, smaller but louder. And then the third, a girl, tiny and fierce, her cry softer but sharp. 3 lives, 3 heartbeats, born from a deal that wasn't a deal anymore. "They're perfect," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. She reached out, trembling, as the nurses placed them in her arms one by one. James watched, frozen, as she cradled them, dark hair, wrinkled hands, eyes blinking up at her. He'd wanted this, planned it, but nothing prepared him for the weight of it, the way it hit him like a tidal wave. "You did it," he said, his voice barely audible, his hand still in hers. "You're amazing." She smiled through her tears, exhausted but glowing, and for a moment, it was just them, the 5 of them, in a bubble nothing could touch. But that bubble burst too soon. Her smile faltered, her eyes clouding with something darker, and James saw it. The shadow of the contract, the clause that said she'd leave in 90 days. She was theirs now, but not forever. "James," she said, her voice shaking as she looked at the babies. "I can't. I don't want to go. But I promised." His stomach dropped, the joy curdling into dread. "We'll figure it out," he said, but the words felt hollow. He leaned down, pressing his lips to her forehead, tasting the salt of her tears, and stayed there, holding on like he could stop time. The next morning, Sarah rested in her hospital room, the triplets asleep in a bassinet beside her. The space was quiet, sunlight filtering through the blinds, the air tinged with the faint scent of antiseptic and flowers, dozens of them, roses and lilies spilling over every surface. She frowned, confused. James hadn't mentioned flowers. Then the door creaked open, and Ethan Brooks stepped in. Ethan was James's lawyer, a lean guy in his late 30s with warm brown eyes and a smile that could charm anyone. He'd been around through the pregnancy, drawing up papers, checking in, always polite but distant. Now, though, he carried a different energy, a nervous edge, as he set another bouquet on the table. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Ed, how you holding up?" "Better now," Sarah said, sitting up a little, her wrist still bandaged from the fall months back. "What's with all the flowers?" "They're from me," Ethan admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Thought you deserved something nice after everything." She blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, thanks, Ethan. That's sweet." He took a step closer, his hands in his pockets, and the air shifted. "Sarah, I need to say something," he started, his tone serious now. "I know this is fast, and maybe it's the worst timing, but I can't keep it in anymore." Her brows furrowed, unease creeping in. "What are you talking about?" "I've been watching you go through this. Strong, brave, incredible," he said, his voice dropping. "And somewhere along the way, I fell for you. Hard." He pulled a small box from his pocket, a ring box, and her breath caught. "I want to give you a real life, Sarah. No contracts, no clauses, just us. Marry me." The room spun, her heart pounding as she stared at the box, then at him. "Ethan, she stammered, her mind racing. Before she could finish, the door swung open, and James walked in, a coffee in one hand, a bag of bagels in the other. He froze, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Ethan, then the ring. "What the hell's going on?" he demanded, his voice low, dangerous. Ethan turned, unflinched, and met his gaze. "I'm asking her to marry me, James. She deserves more than this deal you've trapped her in." "Trapped?" James snapped, setting the coffee down hard enough to slosh it. "You think you can waltz in here with flowers and a ring and fix everything? Back off, Brooks." "Guys," Sarah tried, her voice weak, but they ignored her. "She's not a transaction," Ethan said, stepping forward, his calm cracking. "I love her, James. Can you say the same?" The words hit James like a punch, his fists clenching at his sides. He wanted to say it. God, he wanted to, but the jealousy boiling in his chest drowned it out. He'd been there for her, carried her through a storm, watched her bring his kids into the world. And now this? Ethan, his friend, his lawyer, standing there like he had a claim. "You don't know shit about what she needs," James growled, his voice shaking. "You're out of line." "Am I?" Ethan shot back, his eyes blazing. "Or are you just pissed because you're losing control?" "Stop it," Sarah yelled, her voice cutting through the room. She sat up straighter, wincing at the pain in her ribs. "Both of you, just stop. I'm exhausted. I just had 3 kids, and you're turning this into a damn pissing match." They froze, turning to her. Her face was flushed, her eyes blazing with frustration and fatigue. "Ethan, I'm flattered, but I can't deal with this right now. And James—" She looked at him, her gaze softening but sharp. "You don't get to act like you own me." James's jaw tightened, guilt and anger warring in his chest. Ethan nodded slowly, pocketing the ring. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said quietly. "Rest. I'll be around if you need me." He shot James a hard look before walking out, the door clicking shut behind him. Silence fell, heavy and thick. James stood there, staring at the floor, the bagels still dangling from his hand. Sarah sank back against the pillows, her hands covering her face. "Sarah," he started, but she cut him off. "Not now," she said, her voice muffled. I need to think." He nodded, setting the bag down and stepping back. "Okay," he said, his voice low. "I'll be outside." He left the room, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. Love, control, loss. He'd thought he had this figured out, but now it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to hold on. Who will Sarah choose? Don't miss the next twist. Subscribe and leave a love or loyalty in the comments to weigh in. January rolled into Seattle with a quiet chill, the kind that settles into your bones after the holidays fade. 3 months had passed since the triplets, Jack, Henry, and Lily, came screaming into the world, turning James Carter's sleek Lake Union mansion into a chaos of cribs, bottles, and tiny socks. The nursery glowed with soft light now, the walls painted a pale blue Sarah had picked out, the air tinged with the sweet scent of baby powder. Life had shifted, James and Sarah orbiting around the kids, their old tension replaced by a fragile, unspoken bond. But today, that bond was about to be tested. Sarah stood in the nursery, folding a stack of onesies, her movements slow and deliberate. She was still sore from childbirth, her wrist brace gone, but her ribs tender, and the weight of the day pressed on her like a stone. 90 days. The contract's deadline loomed, the clause that said she'd pack up and leave, taking a fat check and a one-way ticket back to nowhere. She'd been up all night, watching the babies sleep, memorizing their faces, Jack's dimples, Henry's pout, Lily's tiny fists. She couldn't do it. She couldn't walk away. Downstairs, James paced the living room, his gray eyes flicking to the clock on the wall. He'd spent the morning on edge, the contract burning a hole in his desk drawer. He'd tried to bury it, to pretend it didn't exist, but Ethan's words from the hospital still echoed. "I love her. Can you say the same?" He could. He knew it now, had known it since the night he carried her through the storm. But saying it, that was another story. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. Sarah came down the stairs, a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her face pale but set. She stopped at the bottom, her green eyes meeting his, and the air turned thick. "You're leaving," James said, his voice flat, though his chest tightened. "Yeah," she replied, her tone steady but brittle. "It's day 90. That's the deal." He stepped closer, his jaw working. "Where you going? Ethan's place?" Her eyes flashed, anger sparking behind the exhaustion. "Don't start that again, James. This isn't about him, it's about us, what we agreed to." "Then why does it feel like you're running?" He shot back, his voice rising. "You've been here, with me, with them. Does that mean nothing?" "It means everything," she snapped, dropping the bag with a thud. "That's why this sucks so bad. I love those kids. I love you, you idiot. But I signed that damn paper. I'm keeping my word." The room went still, her words hanging between them like a live wire. James stared at her, his breath catching. "You what?" Sarah's face crumpled, tears welling up as she looked away. "I love you," she said again, quieter now, her voice breaking. "Since that first day in the rain, when you dragged me into your car, I didn't want to. I fought it. But it's there, and it's killing me to leave." He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her unravel. She took a shaky breath, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "There's something else," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Back in Tacoma, before I came here, I had a baby. A girl. She didn't make it, born too early. I lost her and I lost myself. That's why I said yes to you. I thought maybe this could fix me." The confession hit him like a brick, cracking open something he'd kept locked tight. He saw it now, the pain she'd carried, the way she'd poured it into the triplets, into him. He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling the contract from his pocket as he went. It was creased and worn, a relic of a plan that didn't fit anymore. "Then don't go," he said, holding it up. Before she could respond, he tore it in half, the rip loud in the silence. He kept going, shredding it into pieces, letting them fall like snow to the floor. "Screw this thing. I don't want it. I want you." Sarah's mouth fell open, her eyes wide. "James, what are you—" "I'm done," he said, stepping closer, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been an asshole, hiding behind this paper because I was scared. 2 wives walked out on me, took everything but my pride. And I swore I'd never let anyone in again. But you snuck past every wall I built. I love you, Sarah. I love you so damn much it hurts." She stared at him, tears streaming down her face, and then she laughed, a soft, broken sound. "You're such a jerk," she said, shaking her head. "Why'd you wait till now to say that?" "Because I'm a dumbass," he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He dropped to his knees in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Stay. Not for the kids, not for some deal. For me. Marry me, Sarah. Be my family." Her breath hitched, her hands trembling in his. She looked down at him, this man who'd gone from a cold stranger to the center of her world, and the weight of the past 3 months, the fall, the birth, the fight. melted away. "You mean it?" she whispered. "More than anything," he said, his gray eyes steady, shining with something raw and real. She nodded, a sob breaking free as she pulled him up and into her arms. He wrapped her in a tight embrace, burying his face in her hair, and she clung to him, her tears soaking his shirt. "I love you," she murmured against his chest. "Yes, I'll stay." He pulled back just enough to kiss her, deep, fierce, a promise sealed in the quiet of the room. The shredded contract lay scattered around them, a past they'd outgrown, and upstairs, the triplets slept on, oblivious to the moment that made them a family. Months later, the mansion buzzed with life. It was a cool April evening, the lake sparkling under a fading sun, and the living room was packed with a small crowd. Friends, a few colleagues, the nurse who'd delivered the triplets. James stood by the fireplace, a simple black suit hugging his frame, a glass of champagne in his hand. Sarah was beside him, radiant in a white dress that flowed over her still healing body, her auburn hair loose and glowing. Jack, Henry, and Lily gurgled in their bouncers nearby, dressed in tiny outfits that made everyone coo. The wedding was small, just them and the people who mattered, but it felt huge, a celebration of something neither had expected. James caught Sarah's eye as the officiant droned on, and she smirked, leaning close. "You clean up nice, Carter," she whispered. "You're not so bad yourself, Monroe," he shot back, his grin softening into something tender. They said their vows, short, honest, messy with emotion, and when the I-do's were done, James kissed her again, slow and deep, the room erupting in cheers. The triplets squealed, adding their own chaos, and Sarah laughed against his lips, her hands on his chest. Later they stood on the deck, the lake stretching out before them, the triplets asleep inside under the nurse's watch. James wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. The air smelled of rain and pine, a faint drizzle starting to fall, a Seattle constant. "Never thought I'd end up here," he said, his voice low, reflective. "Thought I'd be alone forever." "Me neither," she replied, her fingers lacing through his. "Guess we're both pretty bad at sticking to plans," he chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best mistake I ever made." She smiled, looking out at the water, the rain rippling its surface. She'd come to this city broken, lost everything once. But now she had a home, a family, a love she hadn't dared hope for. And James, he'd found what he'd been chasing all along, not in a contract or a legacy, but in her, in them. The drizzle turned to a steady patter, but they didn't move. They stood there, wrapped in each other, the rain washing away the past, leaving only the unwritten pact they'd made, not on paper, but in their hearts. From a contract to a family. How's that for a ride? Subscribe to catch more stories like this, and drop a "Forever Rain" in the comments to share your thoughts.